Arabic, Korean, Japanese, Mandarin Chinese, all languages that are considered to be incredibly hard. But what if I told you that they aren't? What's up everyone, my name's Ian and I'm an American polyglot that's been learning languages for a very long time and now makes videos on YouTube to hopefully make language learning easier for others. And today we're talking about languages that are considered to be difficult and why there is no such thing as a difficult language. Now, if you believe that languages such as the ones I listed at the beginning of this video, such as Arabic, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, are the hardest languages in the world, meanwhile English is the easiest, well, you're not alone. This is a relatively common belief. In fact, the Foreign Service Institute, as well as the United States government, both list Arabic, Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean as the hardest languages to learn in the world, requiring over 2,200 in-class hours to learn fluently. Meanwhile, languages such as Spanish, French, and Italian are considered easy, though this doesn't necessarily paint the full picture. First of all, this is exclusively from the point of view of an English speaker, with the assumption that the more different a language is from English, the harder it is. Though that isn't exactly right. The reality with languages is that every major language in the world has made it onto a top 10 hardest language list somewhere. If a language exists, chances are there's someone out there who's called it the hardest language to learn for non-native speakers. And while there are some languages that appear on these top 10 lists a lot more often than others, there's a good chance that English as well as Mandarin have both been considered the hardest language to learn by someone on some list somewhere. And if every language can make the claim that they are the hardest language to learn for non-native speakers, well, that should just go to show you how trivial it is to make that claim in the first place. So that brings me to my first point. Different does not equal difficult, or at least the picture is a lot more complex than that. The world is a very complex place, and people are very intersectional these days. People have very complex identities, and very few people fall into just one simple bucket, and the same is true for languages. For example, if Swedish is your native language, then you're already halfway towards learning other Scandinavian languages such as Danish or Norwegian. And if you try to learn a language like Russian, for example, well, it would take a lot more time. And that's because Russian would force you to learn a whole new alphabet, whereas Danish is already very similar to Swedish to begin with, and so it would naturally take less time to learn. You would be more familiar with it. And same goes for languages that are supposedly similar, but lack certain aspects of a language. For example, if English is your native language, well then, you would think that German would be a language that's very easy for you to learn, because they're both considered Germanic languages. They're from the same language family. But while English is very similar to German because of their common ancestor, English does not have a declension system. It doesn't have a case system like German does, which can make German far more difficult to learn. Whereas someone whose native language is a Slavic language, such as Russian, which does have a case system, well, the grammar in German would be a lot easier for them to learn, whereas the vocabulary, not so much. But as is often the case these days, if you grew up in a very multicultural environment and you speak, for example, English and Russian, and you're now trying to learn German, well then, the grammar in German will be far easier for you because you're used to how cases work in Russian, and the vocabulary will be pretty straightforward for you because, well, English is a Germanic language just like German. And so a lot of perceived difficulty has to do with the relationship of the language you're learning to the languages that you already know. And yes, that means that there is someone else in this world that might think English is the hardest language in the world. And that might just be because the language they speak is nothing like English at all. But that, of course, says nothing about your perceived difficulty in the process of learning itself. So that brings me to my second point, which is, what do you find hard? What kind of person are you? If you're a very analytical person, well, an analytical mind might have an easier time learning languages that are considered difficult, but are very analytical in nature, such as Arabic or Russian, because, well, it just suits them better. An analytical mind might find the case system in Russian to be very straightforward and procedural, and it might just come across easier. Or in the case of Arabic, where most vocabulary comes from short root syllables, they could learn vocabulary very, very quickly by memorizing those short root words and the vocabulary that stems from them. Similarly, those that are more musically inclined might have a much easier time learning languages that are considered incredibly difficult, such as the ones that we find in East Asia, such as Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, and Vietnamese, because they have an ear for the tones that other people might have a much harder time perceiving. And so, believe it or not, all those music classes that you took when you were a kid might just make it so that learning Chinese is far easier for you than anybody else around you. And so when you look at something like a top 10 most difficult languages list, don't be discouraged, because you don't know what attributes that you have that would make learning a certain language easier than, well, whatever's posted on the Foreign Language Service Institute page. And now this takes us to point number 3, which is the more languages you know, the easier it becomes to learn more languages. And this might just be because every time you learn a new language, you become more familiar with the learning process. There is something to be said about efficiency in learning. If you're becoming more efficient as a learner, which is something that happens naturally when you learn more and more languages, well then learning yet another language will naturally only be easier, not just because you know more languages now, but also because you're just a more efficient learner. And of course, the impact of globalization and how languages impact one another. History is very complex, and language and history often tie together. And so you will find a lot of traces of certain languages amidst others. For example, if you speak 3 languages, and one of those 3 languages is Spanish, and now you want to learn Tagalog as your 4th language, you might just find it to be a lot easier than if you didn't know Spanish, because of the impact that Spanish has had on Tagalog. Same goes for Russian, for example. If you've learned French and you speak French, and you're now trying to learn Russian, you might be surprised at the number of French-based vocab words that now exist in Russian because of the impact that the French language had on Russia historically. And so it just goes without saying, the more languages you know, the easier it gets. And the last factor which impacts how we all learn languages is motivation and approach. And honestly, I should have probably mentioned this before anything else in this video, because it's arguably the most important factor, but it can all basically be summed down to this. The more interested you are in a language and the more motivated you are to learn a language, the easier it will be. It will actually be much easier for an Englishman that's very interested in Korean media and culture to learn Korean than it would be for someone from Italy who's just bored and looking to learn French out of boredom, because they're not really interested, despite French and Italian being very similar languages. Because as corny as it sounds, practice really does make perfect. And practice is something that's hard to do if you're not motivated. And finding motivation is hard to do if you're not passionate, and passion can only be found when you have a genuine interest in a culture, in a language, and everything that goes with learning that language. And of course, a vital part of motivation and approach is, well, the approach. And if you want to know what my approach is to learning languages, well, I have another video on this channel where I talk about how it is that I approach learning new languages. And if that's something that interests you, well, you can find that somewhere here on the screen or in the description down below. But to conclude everything that I've said in this video, there is really no hard language. When you hear someone talking about how one language is harder than another, well, that might just be from their perspective or from what they've seen online, which itself is based on one singular perspective. The world is a very diverse and varied place, and so it's very hard to just draw simple conclusions like one language is harder or easier than another. What might be hard or easy for you may not be the same for someone else. And so every time you look at a top 10 hardest languages list and see Mandarin Chinese, well, think about who it is that made that video and who it is that video is targeted towards and who it is that you are. If you are a musician that is very deeply interested in East Asian or Chinese culture, well, Mandarin might not be the hardest language in the world for you, whereas it might be for the bored American that is just watching this video out of curiosity. And so if there's one thing that you should take away from this video, it's that you shouldn't be discouraged by people saying that a language is too hard or perhaps even too easy. What you should be focused on is the reason behind learning the language that you're learning, whether or not those reasons are right for you, and whether or not that language is right for you. Because ultimately, you're the one who decides how difficult a language is going to be to learn. Nobody else. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, then as always, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts. And if you want me to make more videos like this, or if you like this topic in particular, then feel free to ask any further questions in the comments. I'll try to get back to them the best that I can, and that'll let me know that you want to see more of this kind of video in the future. And so, with that being said, thank you all for watching, and we'll see each other in the next video. Peace.